So, welcome back to Lawrence Explains Online Academic Tuition. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the question of Priestley's thesis in the play. This is certainly a play that is a thesis play. It's not really quote-unquote open to interpretation as such, like it's very clear the message that Priestley has and the message that the inspector has. And I'm going to analyze in this video whether there really is a moral or social value in his thesis, or whether actually it's something that should be discarded. So I'm going to take you through slide by slide and present some pretty robust and I would say probably pretty destructive criticisms of Priestley's thesis. So there are a number of thesis statements in the play itself, and we're going to go through them one by one. So this is a quotation here in the middle from the inspector, and I'll just read it out now. Because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards, and what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide. So this is when when the inspector is discussing Eva's death with Burling. And Burling says, what does any of this have to do with me, kind of thing, and what does her death have to do with her losing her job 2 years ago? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. And the inspector invokes a chain of causation. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next. And the great issue I have with this quotation, and I think most people would have, is the complete passivity that it attributes to Eva Smith. That she is just a pawn on a chessboard being moved around by people of a high level of social influence, or she is the end dominoes being knocked over by a bunch of other dominoes. There's a kind of chain of causation, as if everything is basically predetermined, and once that chain of causation begins, there's no stopping it. This is a thesis which is it's basically it's a determinist thesis, which I think almost most sensible people would reject. And I've said here at the top, passivity. Does Eva, a feisty young protester that we meet at the start of that we're introduced to towards the beginning, does she have no will or mind of her own? There are so many choice points within the within the play. There's so many times when Eva has a choice of different courses of actions, and many of your actions are totally counterproductive. But in any case, she seems to have a will of her own, and if she doesn't, it's a strangely unrealistic character. People do have a will and mind of their own, and Eva in the play has many occasions on which she has multiple options open to her. So I think this is a very, very patronizing way of the inspector viewing events. And the other thing I would point out as well is there is a condescension in the inspector's manner. He has it's almost a narcissistic omnipotence about him, that he knows all. He knows more about Eva Smith, perhaps, than she knew about herself. I mean, this is the height of arrogance, in my view. So there's an incoherence to this idea that, Eva Smith she's just a leaf floating in the wind. She has no mind or will of her own. It doesn't seem to fit with the Eva that we're introduced to towards the beginning of the text. So this next quotation here is another widely cited quotation where there is an interchange between Burling and the inspector. And Burling says, admittedly, somewhat callously, I refused, of course, dismissing the raise that his employees had asked for. And the inspector says, why? And Burling says, we'd have added 12% to our labour costs. And later on, the inspector says, it's better to ask for the world than take it, which is somewhat ironic, given that the political philosophy that he's espousing is socialism, is communism. It's ironic that he's sort of critiquing people who supposedly take the world, when that is literally the philosophy of communism, that everything in a nation is appropriated by the state. But anyway, that aside, there's a sense in which Burling's response is somewhat trivialized. We've added 12% to our labour cost. Okay, that on its own doesn't necessarily mean very much. But the question is, from an economics point of view, how would that increase in labour costs affect the business? This is something I discussed in another video. Probably fairly significantly. It would be money that couldn't be invested in other areas. It would be an angle for your competitors to get into, to potentially get in ahead of you and make developments that you weren't making. So there is always a balance, in a business or any organization or in a nation. If you increase spending in one area, it has to be decreased in another area. This is just how things are. And as I said there, what would the competition do? And then there are other questions. These are the kind of questions that some an economist like Milton Friedman, a 20th century Nobel Prize-winning economist at the Chicago School, actually said when asked about Victorian England and the industrial period, and his response was, granted, these were not fantastic conditions. No one's saying that they were. But the question is not whether they were fantastic by today's standards. The question is, were they better than their alternative? Were they better than conditions had been in recent history in rural England? And the answer to that is yes. And so the question I have here is, were factory workers better off in the industrial period than farm labourers had been in previous centuries? And the answer has to be yes. Because the question, why do the employees take the job to begin with? If they're worse off in every way, they're not going to take the jobs to begin with. It just makes no sense. Why would anybody do that? You're not going to take a job that's significantly worse in every way to a job you've previously held. This kind of idea that all of these industrial jobs, while not jobs that we would want to do, to be honest with you, in the modern world, were just innately immoral and exploitative. That really doesn't really make a lot of historical sense. In actual fact, they were a slight improvement on the type of labour that was done previous to this. Okay, so this next quotation is probably the most famous one, and this is one I really want to challenge quite strongly. And I mean, it's just wow. It's just absurd. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other, and I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. Okay, so there are a number of things going on here. One is just a number of incoherent statements and incorrect statements by the inspector, and without any explanation as to what these ideas really mean and how they actually look in real life. So, we don't live alone. This is true. Nobody disputes that. We are members of one body. Okay. So at this point, we're already making pretty specious assertions. I mean, that is not the history of humanity. The history of humanity is different tribes, different groups, different families, even different individuals within a family. People just ask yourself, within your own family, would you say that you're all members of one body? That's probably going a little bit far. You're a family, you have relationships, you have family ties, but to say you're just kind of one unit is a little bit much. And as I put at the top here, there's just no empirical evidence that this is the case at all. It's just a statement said apropos of nothing. And in fact, all empirical evidence would suggest that it's far more complex than that. We're individuals, we're families, we're groups, we're tribes, we are nation states, we're cities and so on. But to say we're all members of one body is just nonsense. We're all responsible for each other. Okay, sounds interesting. Really ask yourself that. Do you agree with that? Do you feel responsible for somebody if we're all responsible for each other, then that means you are responsible for the life of somebody living in Malaysia. You're responsible for them. We're all responsible for each other. Or even you are responsible for somebody living at the other end of the country you've never seen. This is highly questionable, and it's incorrect. There's no possible way that you can be responsible for people you've never even met. It makes no sense. And the question I put up here is, this statement, it's so absurd, but what would this even look like? Charity, okay, you're allowed to, you could take on some responsibility for somebody else, assist them in some way. State communism, is that the answer? And in the case of Priestley, this is where he was going. He thinks state communism is the answer, because the state will take care of everything, make sure everyone's equal, everyone's going to be fine. And there are a number of, well, I'll come on to how that actually looks in a moment, because I think it's something that students are not aware of. So if you've got this file, please stay tuned for that, because you're going to learn some stuff that I think you'll find somewhat shocking, and it's not taught in the school system, mainly because there is a huge leftist bent in particularly in the English in the English examinations. It is what it is. It's something that's, if you work in the English, teaching English, it's pretty obvious pretty quickly, and it's just taken as axiomatic. So we're going to learn a little bit more about state communism at the end of this video. The other question I would say here is, who decides what that responsibility looks like? We're all responsible for each other. Okay, what does that look like? And who decides what we have to do for each other? Who is that? Who is that person? Inevitably, it's someone who is an elite, an omnipotent, person. This is, George Orwell's "We're all equal, but some are more equal than others." This is what it ends up being. And then the last section here of this quotation: "If men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish." This is, what are you talking about? This is a threat of violence. If we don't learn your nonsensical lesson, which is we're all responsible for the world, I've already proven that's complete nonsense. Then you're going to teach us this in fire and blood and anguish. Please give me a break. This is a clear threat of violence and coercion. If you don't agree with my nonsensical idea, you're going to be subject to violence. My goodness me. And this is supposed to be a moral lesson that is being delivered to the audience. Priestley, my goodness. Please. High of arrogance, in my view. Let's just go on to another quotation here. This is getting long, this video, but please stick with me, because I'm going scorched earth here with Priestley's thesis. This is in that same quotation. "There are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still with us, their lives, their hopes, their fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with ours." Really, there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, as I put in this quotation here. Are there? Is every person's situation identical? Do they all make the same decisions? Are these, Eva Smiths and John Smiths, are they lemmings? Are they robots? You know, in my experience of life so far, I haven't met two people who are identical. I've really rarely met people who even have identical situations. Everyone's situation is particular. Every circumstance is particular. Every family is individual. Every a group is individual. This is nonsense to put people in as if they're avatars. They have no identity, no individuality of their own, and these passive beings. It's again, it's so elitist. It's this sneering kind of, I'm not a man of the people, but I'm for the people kind of nonsense. It is absolutely insufferable. Their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with ours. You know, there's an assumption of knowledge here. There's an assumption that the inspector knows about the lives of these millions of people. You know, that the inspector understands what will make them happy. You know, I'm sure the millions of people, I'm sure each individual person themselves is perfectly capable of moving towards happiness and away from suffering. This is pretty basic, you know, human instinct. And I'm sure they know a lot more about their own lives and their own prospects and their own situation than any inspector or any intellectual in the form of Priestley. And again, the question, you know, what does this even mean, their chance of happiness? What are you even talking about? You know, the overall question here is where are the boundaries here? You know, where are the boundaries of the state, of our responsibilities to each other? How, with limited resources, can each of us take care of everybody else? And how can everybody be entwined with our lives? It just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's said with such conviction, but it is self-evidently nonsense. Okay, so just a few final points here. The inspector acts as though he has infinite knowledge, anointed from on high. You know, this is very, very typical of intellectuals, to be honest with you. And there's a supreme arrogance that you'll find with intellectuals. And by an intellectual, I mean somebody whose end product is an idea, whose end product of their labor, their work, is an idea. You know, an architect is a very intelligent person, but an architect is not an intellectual because their end product is a building. You know, so if their thinking is wrong, the end product will show that, and the building will not be built, or it will collapse, or something will go wrong, and their reputation will be ruined. Whereas with an intellectual, the end product is an idea. And very often these ideas are untested, and if they are a failure, it doesn't really have any material consequence to the intellectual spouting the nonsense. The inspector purports to represent Eva Smith. Again, I think this is the height of arrogance. It's a sort of patronising misogyny. That Eva Smith was not. I think there is a kind of patronising, you know, paternal aspect to this whole thing, that Eva Smith had no backbone and a will of her own. I just think that's unrealistic. The haughty detachment of the inspector, he has this omniscient tone. I find it, you know, incredibly irritating. The political lecture at the end of the play is not only incoherent, it threatens violence, it also advocates policies that led to the suffering, starvation, death, humiliation, and immiseration of millions and millions of people, tens of millions of people in Russia, Eastern Europe and China. Certainly Russia and China have never recovered from these ideas, from the spread of communism to these countries. Russia is now, you know, it's more of a market economy, but for reasons I may go into in the next video, it's essentially run, it's a kind of group of oligarchs loosely overseen by Putin, and that is a direct consequence of the USSR and state communism. China obviously is still a communist country. There's, you know, civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, etc., etc. severely limited in China, although obviously as they've started to adopt a market approach to their economy, at least their standard of living has improved in recent years. So they've kind of made some kind of a half recovery. Eastern Europe is probably the area that has recovered most, I would say, post-communism. But my goodness, how these people suffered. I'm going to go into that in the next video because I don't have time to do it here. But if you would like to learn more about the consequences of communism, radical socialism, socialism and communism do need to be separated in fairness. But one is that communism is obviously a more radical expression of socialism. Socialism itself, has so many failings. I'm afraid it doesn't have a great track record, to be honest with you. But communism is beyond even failing. There is really nobody or very few people of sound mind who would ever seriously make a defense of state communism at this point. So the final point here is empirical evidence abounds about the result of paternal or nanny states. So whatever the intention was, the cost that is incurred by creating these states is so vast that any potential benefit that was believed to be there at the beginning is totally overrun by misery, squalor, desperation, and death. So we're going to look at that in the next video. I just don't have time to do it here. I'm going to look at the effects of state communism on two countries in particular. I might even talk as well about my time in Cuba as well, which is one of the very few continued state communist regimes. So we'll leave things there. Hopefully that's been some food for thought on Priestley's thesis. It irritates me that this held up as this great moral lesson. I think it's an absolutely nonsensical moral lesson. There is no moral or ethical value beyond perhaps some very basic interpersonal lessons. Don't be needlessly selfish and cruel to people. Okay, that's a good lesson. But as far as something that can be scaled over social institution and a whole society and economy, there's absolutely nothing there. It's an absolute absurdity. It's something I don't see presented anywhere near enough to students, and that's because there is a overwhelmingly leftist bent in the education system, particularly in the humanities. So it's something that I just think needs to be looked at a little bit more to give people a little bit more balance. This video is it's all based on empiricism. That is, for me, empiricism trumps any political belief. Empiricism is about evidence and testing, and that's what it's about. The political ideas and beliefs are just, they must be subject to empirical testing, just as any other type of idea or belief must be. So that's kind of my angle on everything. So I'll leave you there, and good night and God bless.